Good afternoon, everyone. Dear professors, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, señoras y señores, welcome to the public examination of the doctoral dissertation, Professor, University in Germany as the opponent of the examination. My name is Enrico Minin, Geography at the University of Helsinki, and I, as the Custos nominated by the Faculty of Science, I declare this public examination. Gonzalo Cortés-Capano will give his lectio precursoria.
Honorable Custos, honorable opponent, dear audience, welcome everyone. I would like to start this presentation by inviting you to a location somewhere on Earth, as you can see from the geographic coordinates. We know that it is located in southern Uruguay, but we can get more information about this location. We can see that there is a beach, that there is a native vegetation, wetlands, there's people, they are enjoying fishing and going to the beach. And we can get even more information. I can tell you that this is my home, it's where I have lived most of my life, and it's where I have my garden, where I plant native trees, where I have my pets. And I can also tell you more. I can share the fact that this house was built originally by my grandparents, with my parents, and I continue building the house. So I have beautiful memories with them. And also now with my friends, we usually go bird watching in the area. So we can add different layers of these coordinates no longer represent only a meaningful location. And it's important because most of our experiences are connected to places. Emulate traces of different generations that have used, transformed, struggled, and lived them, and they represent natural, historic, cultural, and also emotional legacies. Another important aspect about places is that we need to be aware that our decisions today will leave traces and will shape the places where future generations will live and perceive. So, what does all this have to do with voluntary private land conservation, which is dissertation? Well, all experiences where we have been or where we would like to be, and there are as many reasons and ways to conserve these places as people, but we might share common things between us in relation to the fact that we care about these places because they are related to our identities. We also want future generations to be able to continue enjoying and shaping these places. And as we know that these places have been evolving through time, we also want to conserve our ability to adapt. They are going to change, they are changing, and we also want to conserve our agency, meaning our capacity to influence the trajectories of these places. So in order to do this properly, it's very important to understand how people relate to places and nature. So we are currently living a sustainability crisis that threatens not only biodiversity, but also human well-being in relation to food security, health, as we all know now with the COVID pandemic. And in this case, there have been different strategies to contract this crisis, to try to tackle it. But so far, we are far from changing the main trajectory of the world towards sustainability. One of the main strategies to conserve biodiversity are the protected areas. So the protected areas have been evolving in time from an island approach to a network approach, landscape approachable approaches, which integrate people and nature in a better way. However, protected areas have been typically located in areas where there is low conflict with agriculture, so there is a bias in the location. Also, sometimes they lack resources for management, and they eventually end up being paper parks. And they have also, in many cases, have been imposed on local people, creating social conflict and implementing top-down approaches that prevent people from using the resources and the land. So we need to think beyond protected areas. We still need to improve protected areas because they are very important, but we also need to think creatively beyond protected areas. And in this case, traditional cultural landscapes are landscapes where people and nature have co-evolved through time, and people have interacted, perceived, and shaped this cultural landscape according to different worldviews, values, and different contexts. So in this case, many of these landscapes are very important for biodiversity and also for people, but they are currently threatened by pressures from local and global socioeconomic drivers, such as land use change or the abandonment of traditional practices. And these threats affect both people and nature. In this cultural landscape, rural communities play a role through environmental stewardship, which means caring and responsibly managing the environment according to diverse motivations and capacities. So it's important to take into account that many of these cultural landscapes across the world occur on private land. Hence, private land conservation policies, if they are adequately designed, they have the potential to recognize and foster already existing initiatives, increase the area under conservation and sustainable management, and involve diverse stakeholders from the public, private, and civil society sectors, and also involve different knowledge systems such as academic knowledge and local and indigenous knowledge. The main strategies to promote private land conservation fall into involuntary strategies that are related to total land acquisition from the government or from the civil society sector, or impose restrictions on land use. These involuntary strategies, for example, can bring social conflicts over property rights, low landowners' engagement, and bringing also implementation challenges, since landowners are the ones in most cases implementing conservation actions. But beyond involuntary strategies, we have the voluntary strategies, where landowners' willingness to engage is one of the main dimensions, and their long-term participation. And they can take different shapes, from conservation networks to non-binding voluntary contracts and binding voluntary contracts. But in these voluntary strategies, the most important aspect is to identify which are the most appropriate ways to increase landowners' engagement in the future as well. So beyond the promise of private land conservation, voluntary private land conservation policy making is very challenging, because logical, institutional, legal, and economic processes. At the same time, it needs to engage different stakeholders from the private, civil society, and public sector, and all these policies and the preferences and the context are highly context dependent. So in this context, the aim of this thesis, of this dissertation, was to identify challenges and opportunities to foster private land conservation in culturally appropriate ways at different geographical scales. In order to advance into this aim, I started by conducting a global scale literature review to identify the main private land conservation literature trends and gaps. Once that was done, then I continued working empirically in Uruguay, taking Uruguay as a case study for a real world case, and conducted a local scale study following a place-based approach, where the aim was to understand landowners' relationship with nature and their vision for the future and their main needs in order to advance into that vision. And also, after that local scale study, I conducted a national scale study also in Uruguay to understand landowners' preferences for novel voluntary private land conservation policies. So beyond the aim of informing academic literature, I had the aim also of informing context-dependent policy recommendations. So why Uruguay? Uruguay is located in southeastern South America, in the Rio de la Plata ecoregion, which is an old-growth grassland biome that is currently threatened, one of the most threatened biomes and least protected in the world. So the Uruguay is a proper place to understand private land conservation and to investigate, because 95% of the land is privately owned. The national system of protected areas occupies around 1% of the country area, and we are currently experiencing land use change from native grasslands to soy plantations and afforestation. So there is a need and an opportunity to understand landowners' preferences at different scales and inform voluntary private land conservation policy making. So in Uruguay, humans shape the landscape, and this brings many challenges and also opportunities. Taking this into account, I navigated what Heider and colleagues call an undisciplinary journey, which means that to target these research questions, it requires engaging with various research strategies in order to embrace complexity and uncertainty along the research process. So I started a bit on trying to frame the research questions from a conceptual la-la land, where you are trying to understand what are the main needs for research. Then when you understand that, you move into an uncomfortable space because you don't have the methodological groundness to approach the questions. Afterwards, you conduct a disciplinary immersion to try to learn new methodologies and methods to tackle these research questions. And hopefully, after that, you start advancing into a sustainability rigorous science, which is also part of the loop, because new questions emerge, and then the process starts. So my aim was to follow a transdisciplinary approach where I collaborated and learned from different academic disciplines, including anthropology, agronomy, economics, psychology, and geography, but also with non-academic stakeholders, such as landowners, decision makers, and civil society. So the engagement with these groups was during the different stages of the research process. So there were many aspects that were co-designed, like problem formulation and research design, and also co-produced, since we conducted different stages of the research together, deliberated on the results and communicate them. And well, then the other stage of the research process, which is co-implement, was of course more on the side of the local stakeholders, and we can discuss about that later as well. I also follow a mixed method approach, which means that there is an integration of qualitative and quantitative methods. So qualitative methods allow for in-depth understanding and discussion back and forth with interviewees to get a better understanding of the context, but they also have limitations in terms of the transferability of the results, because they probably apply only to that region in depth. And then the quantitative methods are not so good for understanding in depth the context, but they are very good from the statistical point of view, because they allow more for generalization. So by using this strategy, in the first, second, and third chapter of this thesis, we try to get the best out of the combination of these different approaches. So the first chapter was at the global scale, the literature review that was entitled "The Emergence of Private Land Conservation in Scientific Literature, a Review." And I found that there was a strong geographic bias where most of the studies had been conducted in only 4 countries, namely the US, Australia, South Africa, and Canada. And this brings cautiousness when to import different results into other contexts, because as we saw before, the success of private land conservation policies are highly context dependent. Then I also found that there is a strong focus on property rights and financial policy instruments to incentivize landowners. So from the research side, there is a need to address a broader set of policy instruments according to context, for example, facilitative policy instruments. And I also found a low stakeholder engagement in the research processes. So it is important to increase stakeholder engagement to better understand the complexities and the different worldviews, values, and perspectives, and also to better document the processes, so we can all learn from the process. Then, after identifying some of these gaps, we aim to target them at the local scale, conducting this place-based approach study entitled Exploring Landowners' Perceptions, Motivations and Needs to Inform Voluntary Conservation Policy Making. This study was conducted in northeastern Uruguay in a high priority area for biodiversity conservation and ecosystem services, and also for cultural heritage conservation. This area has been identified as a priority at the national level, but also at the international level, because it is an IBA, an important bird area, and also part of a UNESCO reserve. In this cultural landscape, approximately 70 families live in the rural area, and the main production is traditional low-intensity cattle ranching on native grasslands. So we developed a model where we aimed at understanding the social ecological context in depth, meaning the benefits that people could perceive from nature, but also the conflicts with nature, their sense of place, and the perceived social ecological problems. And by understanding those key issues, we would better be able to identify the appropriate, locally and culturally appropriate stewardship facilitation instruments, and then in that case, trying to identify ways of supporting both people and nature in this cultural landscape. Traditional cattle ranching on native grasslands was a core element of landowners' stewardship, self-identity, social cohesion, and daily connections with nature. And hence, we also understood that biodiversity conservation goals in this cultural landscape cannot be pursued in isolation from social and rural development. So, integrating aspects results from this local scale study, I am at addressing the preferences of different landowners at the national scale. So in the third chapter, entitled Assessing Landowners' Preferences to Inform Voluntary Private Land Conservation, the Role of Non-Monetary Incentives, the aim was to address the landowners' preferences and assess the relative preferences for non-monetary incentives and monetary incentives at the national scale. And I found that landowners in Uruguay at the national scale actually preferred non-monetary incentives as a way of supporting their stewardship in contrast to monetary incentives, because this was related to their will for autonomy, competence, and relatedness, as long as the conservation areas would allow for cattle ranching on native grasslands in line with the findings of the local scale. So landowners were willing to engage in voluntary private land conservation if the policies could align with their values and needs, and also landowners that were already participating in groups, both conservation groups or sustainable production groups, showed preferences for longer term agreements and allocating larger proportions of their land to biodiversity conservation. So supporting also landowners' networks would be important for the future. So some concluding reflections. Of course, context matters, and this thesis shows that there are opportunities to develop private land conservation in Uruguay, but of course there are also many challenges, and there is a process to follow. It is important to engage stakeholders early in the policy-making processes, so that also remains an opportunity and a challenge to conduct the stakeholder engagement and participation from the early stages. We need to develop plural policies because there is heterogeneity in the preferences and values and worldviews of landowners. So we need to develop flexible and plural policies. We also need to recognize already existing initiatives and integrate them in a fair and effective governance scheme. We also need to foster resilience both at the property level and also at the network and landscape level. Also develop a monitoring system that would allow to learn both on the landowner side and on the institutional side to improve the policies over time and adapt to changes. And also we need to think and align private land conservation policies in broader sustainability and environmental justice goals at the societal level. So to conclude, even if there is no single solution to the sustainability crisis, private land conservation is not an exception to that. But together with other initiatives, it might provide opportunities to conserve meaningful locations, to conserve our places, and I think that we would really benefit from having more options in this kind of crisis that we are living. So I hope this thesis becomes a place where to meet, to deliberate, and to explore way forwards. Honored Professor Fischer, I now call upon you to present your critical comments on my dissertation.
Thank you very much for your opening presentation. I was going to show a few slides as well, and I believe I have to be given the rights to do that. We can maybe start.
Yeah, you can share your screen.
Apparently I can't. That's my point. Apparently the host has deactivated it.
Okay, we're checking that now.
If not, I'll just say a few words if it's a problem.
Now you should be able. You're in, try now.
Yep, it works now.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so I just want to spend 5 minutes or so. But first of all, before we do this, good afternoon, dear Custos. Good afternoon, Gonzalo, and welcome also to everyone in the audience. So I will just spend maybe 5 minutes sharing very, very briefly some of my own experiences of working on issues to do with people, landscapes, and conservation. Just as a little bit of background so that both Gonzalo, but also the audience get a sense for where I might be coming from as I ask my questions later on. So I'll just literally show something like 5 or 6 pictures here. This is a landscape that is in southeastern Australia where I worked for a very long time. Looks a little bit similar, I thought, when just seeing Gonzalo's slide. And here too, there's a lot of livestock grazing. Here too, there are issues of native pastures being replaced with exotic pastures. And there are all kinds of conservation issues. So this is one of the many parallels that I noticed straight away when reading Gonzalo's work. Here too, farmers are stewards of landscapes, and some of them at least understand themselves very much as stewards of the landscape. We have a quote here by one farmer commenting on this tree, saying, "I just love this tree. You can see a family of animals of whatever sort just under there, and they could spend a whole hot day under there chatting away to one another. It just lightens my heart when I see it." So this sort of appreciation of place of the landscape is very much part of the stewardship ethic of many Australian farmers as well. Also in Australia, we see this exotic pine plantations taking over the landscape, an issue that also is being touched on in Gonzalo's thesis. This here is a picture from Transylvania in Europe, in central Romania. Again, a system where grasslands make up for large parts of the existing ecosystems and where biodiversity is exceptionally high. And again, through the social ecological co-evolution over long periods of time, that's how this system evolved. We see that the grassland is being used in ways, again, where sort of the stewardship and the activities of farmers plays a central role in maintaining the system in the state it is, leading to vast areas of species-rich grasslands with many species of wildflowers, for example, and butterflies, which are being caught in this particular picture here. And just one last parallel before we move on and actually get into a discussion. This picture is not actually taken by me, but it's in sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Africa, where shrub encroachment is a major issue in many landscapes. Shrub encroachment also being something that is mentioned in Gonzalo's work as being a problem in his study area. So I approached my questions here from the perspective very much of identifying many parallels to other parts of the world, and also really feeling that although it is a place-based thesis for most, there are so many aspects of this work that are relevant beyond this particular place. As we go through the next maybe, well, 1 or 1.5 hours or something like that, I'm hoping that we can touch on many different interesting topics that I found exciting in this thesis, and especially towards the end, some of the general implications of this work. So with that, I would like to commence with my questions to Gonzalo. Are you ready?
I'm ready, and thanks for the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for your nice thesis. The first thing I would like to start with is just to get a little bit more of a background understanding. Tell me a bit more about these grassland ecosystems in Uruguay, because I know nothing about Uruguay. How have they co-evolved with people?
Thanks for the question. These grasslands ecosystem have co-evolved with people. They are all growth grasslands. So these grasslands have been there since in the region since the Pleistocene with the megafauna. Then it went extinct, and then the role of humans has been increasingly understood recently through fire management. So there are studies showing how people were managing fire in order to create hunting areas. So they have been shaped by humans in that way in the early days, and since European colonization, they have been going into this cattle ranching landscapes. There was a decrease in native herbivores, so then cattle ranching in low density, like we are talking in most cases about one cow with sheep, so it's low density. It has become one of the main dimensions to shape the landscape, both at the biodiversity, on the biodiversity side, because they control for shrubland encroachment and they create the dynamic patches. But at the same time, on the culture of people living in the countryside, that is kind of related to the gaucho who was following the cows. So it has a lot of implications. And now, from the conservation perspective, as we don't have like big populations of native herbivores, then there is a need to use cattle as a management tool in order to conserve grasslands and to prevent from regime shifts, like at least strong regime shifts from grass-dominated systems to shrub-dominated systems.
So can you explain a little bit more the difference between cattle and sheep here? Because I think in your, which was it? I think in the People and Nature paper, you mentioned sheep a lot, because in that local case study, apparently sheep were very important. But then at the national scale, I think you primarily talked about cattle. So can you just explain this a bit more? So what's the role of sheep versus cattle in this place?
Traditionally, there was a mix of sheep and cattle in the properties. There are regions, because the grasslands are very heterogeneous. So we tend to think about grasslands as only a one ecosystem, but once we go in depth and understand the relationship between the species composition and the type of soil, slope, there are different communities of grasslands, and there are some communities like the basaltic grasslands in the north where sheep are an important production over there, and they are grazers and browsers, so they complement each other. For example, the sheep cuts the grass like shorter and also tolerates more of woody plants like early saplings of shrublands, while the cows, no, the cows are browsers and they use the tongue to pull the food. So in that sense, the relative abundance of these species, that of course it changes through many different drivers, because this is a human-dominated kind of system in that sense, like market drivers, for example, would also influence patterns of overgrazing if there are too many, for example, or too many sheep, or as you were mentioning in the People and Nature paper, that the lack of sheep that control the shrubland encroachment might foster shrubland encroachment in the region. So there is a mix of the two.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And just a couple more questions in terms of getting more background on the study area. You mentioned droughts as well. what's the role of droughts? Do they change in terms of both the socioeconomic side as well as the ecological side of these systems?
Yeah, that's currently also increasing, but probably related to climate change. It has always been a bit of a variable climate in the region, but now droughts are affecting strongly. And in that sense, what landowners say, and also what some research has recently shown, is that these native grasslands, compared to exotic commercial pastures, are much more resilient. So they can use, for example, it's a more heterogeneous landscape, so the diverse species that are present tolerate in different ways, and then the rainfall, for example, when it comes, then it sprouts in a better way. And also, at being more heterogeneous, you have not only the grassland, but also not only the grasses, but also the shrubs that also cows and sheep can eat if there is need. So in that sense, it has been also said by conservationists in Uruguay that the droughts are a bit of a sponsors to the grassland conservation, because many landowners who have invested in transforming grasslands, which is very expensive to exotic pastures, might find themselves into problems if there is an unexpected climatic event like that.
Yeah. Interesting, and again, interesting parallels here to Australia in terms of these kinds of issues with the resilience declining as you are basically, you're boosting output, so you're boosting productivity in the short term, but your resilience might be declining as a result. In Australia, one of the responses by grazing managers is to use holistic grazing management, which uses rotational grazing. Alan Savory's idea originally. Has this arrived in Uruguay, and is it a big thing?
It has arrived to Uruguay, and there are two main schools with a continuous grazing paradigm, that it's like big open areas, because many properties are quite big, even if 80% of the landowners in Uruguay can be categorized as family landowners with smaller properties. But the holistic management from Savory has arrived to Uruguay, and particularly in the region where I conducted the study in northeastern Uruguay, the people are starting to implement it, and there are also people that are local champions promoting this and studying also the consequences of this different management, not only for biodiversity but also and productivity, but also in relation to human well-being. For example, because after they start compartmentalizing the properties, what they found was that they need to spend less time cattle and herding, so they increase their well-being in terms of like keeping like more the relationship also with the animals is different, because they are more used to be in contact with people that are moving them around. So they are studying that, they are implementing it, and some of the needs of the landowners were related to implement this kind of new approach to grassland management.
Very interesting. And one of the observations that I had there, which would be worth looking at in the future, then if you ever do more work there, is that my perception was in Australia that through shifting towards holistic grazing management, not only did the practices shift, but also the mindset of the farmers shifted, because this holistic approach very much is a kind of systems thinking, actually. And the systems thinking is actually already then the next thing that I want to talk to you about. So I think in the interest of time, we've got enough of a background now for the study area as a whole, but let's move on now to some of these sort of key concepts that you've dealt with. And maybe the most central one to all of them, because it brackets everything, is this idea of a social ecological system. You explained that a bit in your introductory chapter. Can you say, in your own words, a bit more, what to you is social ecological systems thinking? What's a social ecological systems approach?
Yeah, the social ecological system approach identifies and brings up the relevance of the interactions between people and nature, where like moving several steps forward from this dichotomy between people and nature as two separate realms that don't interact or one control the other. In this case, understanding that people uses nature, shapes nature, and also, of course, nature provides benefits, but also conflicts with people. Understanding the dynamics of these interactions between people and nature at different scales provides, for example, a new set of opportunities to try to understand the problem from a different angle, from a philosophical even perspective, towards promoting, for example, adaptive management, building up from your previous comments, like, for example, if you are thinking about your property and managing it in a holistic way, you are conscious about your inputs in the system, what you take from the system, and you are on top of the system in a way that you can adapt to changes that come from the more kind of natural side, like climatic events, but also from your own inputs, and learn. And eventually we would be advancing in understanding and managing these systems at different scales.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned one phrase in your introductory chapter where you said that you mentioned the phrase non-reducible emergent properties of systems. So this phrase non-reducible emergent properties, can you just explain a little bit what you mean by that? I thought it was a nice choice of words, but this non-reducible especially. So what's non-reducible about them?
Yeah. Well, that part is interesting because it also has like some philosophical implications. Meaning that the systems, as they get more complex, there are emergent not observable or adequately explained when we go to a lower level of complexity. For example, and this shows also partially the lack of success of the traditional positivist reductionist program life by understanding how the atoms work or how the fundamental particles work. So in this case, as we move up, for example, we can understand my physiology and your physiology in this moment, but the fact that we are talking about the topics that we are discussing cannot be explained by physiological aspects. Even though they are interesting to understand and they add to the picture. So in the ecological sense, it's the same. By understanding a population or a species, necessarily understand how do people make use of ecosystem services that are at a level above the populations. So they emerge from the interaction between the different components. So in other words, just to finalize, the forest is not just the sum of the trees.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I understand better now especially how you meant this phrase non-reducible as well. So thank you for explaining that. One of the changes that people are currently commenting on a bit in sustainability science in general is that there seems to be this, it's an observation, I guess, and maybe not everyone agrees with it, but there is this shift a little bit away almost from social ecological systems towards a relational perspective of the world. I don't know if you've come across this, where people are arguing that if you take this relational perspective, you're moving away even further from different components interacting, and the whole thing becomes even more of a dynamic flux of ever-changing relationships between things. Do you have any opinions on this sort of what people have sometimes called a relational turn or a shift towards a relational paradigm? I mean, this is brand new stuff, but do you have any thoughts on this idea of a relational paradigm, and if and how this might influence sustainability science in the future?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thanks. I think that, in my opinion, I think that it's very important to expand our tools to understand and our perspectives to understand the complexities in the real world. And in that sense, like from a philosophical perspective, we have like intrinsic value that we assign to species independent from our own perspectives. So a species has the right to exist. Then we have instrumental values that traditionally that are like what kind of benefits do we obtain from nature, for example. But this has been kind of a Western-led view that has less traditionally outside a bit the even Western, but non-Western particularly, type of relationship with nature, that it doesn't go against the other two, the intrinsic and the instrumental, but it also expands into the relationship that people have with nature. And that relationship explains or can help us understand why we do some things and why and how to influence our trajectories towards sustainability. So I think in that sense, maybe as any new concept, it might be now in the explanatory phase and an effervescent phase. So we are a bit forgetting about the other two, but I hope that we can get to an understanding that we need the three of them, and even like going beyond a bit values and try to engage with ethical perspectives that are like even like a broader level, where we try to engage with broader questions such as what kind of life we want to live, to our behavior and our values in terms of relations, but also in terms of instrumental values. So I think it provides a novel way of understanding people-nature interaction.
Mm-hmm. We're now in the midst of your undisciplinary journey, I think, in our conversations, which is another thing that I wanted to touch on. I really liked that paper by Jamila Haidar and others on the undisciplinary journey. And in fact, they wrote it based on a discussion panel, I think, at some conference a while back. And I was part of their discussion panel at the time. So it was funny to see that emerge like that as a paper. But it's a really nice idea, this idea of an undisciplinary journey, and that especially for the sort of, let's say, the next generation of scholars like yourself, it creates new dilemmas and new challenges. So can you comment a bit on your personal undisciplinary journey? I mean, you're surrounded here by an audience of something like 40 people watching you right now, who all have decent training in one discipline or another. You're sort of talking about your undisciplinary journey. So do you know even anything about anything? What's your feeling about having gone through this journey?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's always interesting to reflect on the process and the learning process, and I guess that as important as learning in this case, I want to introduce the word unlearn, because that's also part of the balance between that when navigating this journey. So I was trained as an ecologist, just to go a little bit on the background, and I was working with birds, and then I started understanding that there was a need to engage with the better understand why potential solutions. So actually with people which brought a lot of humility from the disciplinary side, because of course I knew not even half of the things that local people knew about the system, about the species, about the threats. So from that perspective, when I started the thesis, I tried to follow this kind of undisciplinary journey, and the paper was very important because it was kind of a companion, and also it's something that, yeah, I felt like I was working with other young researchers or people who were struggling with this, because I didn't have the competence, the methodological competence necessary to analyze interviews doing qualitative analysis. So I had to learn that. And then, of course, with the epistemological agility, if you have like more of an aware positivist position, like then you need to understand that also the way that people perceive things doesn't need to be validated by your methodology necessarily, but it provides a source of information by itself. So then I started thinking about these aspects and trying to learn on the way, and also relating to the kind of research questions, because, for example, with the in-depth approach. I learned how to do it, and then when we started thinking about the national scale, it was like, well, can we actually use this approach in a sensitive way in a short time, as it is a PhD, to understand the national scale? Well, maybe we need to go to a quantitative approach, and we are losing many things from the understanding perspective in depth, but we gain in other aspects, and we try to complement. So I had to change again into a more traditional quantitative approach, and in that process I learned a lot, and I learned as well many things.
Yeah, very nice, thank you. And I particularly liked your comment on how you initially came with your ecological knowledge, and then you were facing, I don't know how you said it, but you basically mentioned the term humility in the process of when you actually come into touch with the real world. And I really just wish there were more disciplinary ecologists putting themselves out there and getting in touch with the real world. And indeed, we would have smarter ideas, I think, about conservation as a result. So it's very nice that you went through this journey. And I think personally, from my observations of your work, now I'm going to talk about methodology with you for a bit. It hasn't suffered from you having jumped between different ways of doing things. I think each of these methods that you used has its own rationale and its own limitations and so on, but you very carefully worked through this. So I just want to comment here that I particularly liked the sampling design for your qualitative study very much, the People and Nature paper. And I also thought your design for the choice experiment was extremely nice and very well thought through. So very good, I think, how you did that. Let's stick with that choice experiment paper for a little bit. And there you mention technical support and training and courses. And to me, I kind of wondered multiple times, but how are they different? This is actually something that, I mean, if you ever get to revise this paper still, that I would even sort of suggest to clarify further. I got stuck with that multiple times, that I thought, okay, I can see how those are important things, but I think training versus technical support.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. Thanks also for noticing, because it's key, and it's currently, it needs further explanation, and it's good to have the opportunity now to explain. Technical support in the way, I mean, we built the design by asking people from different institutions and also on the ground landowners. And then for them, for example, technical support was related to implementation of different type of actions, either production oriented, in order to identify possible ways of conserving biodiversity and producing at the same time, producing food or different things. So it was more on the agronomist, biologist, veterinary assistance on the property management. That was, we need to, for example, as we were talking before, we want to start doing holistic management. So how do we do it? And then getting like support in that sense. Or we have a problem with shrublands. How do we tackle that? And then getting support from that sense. Then the access to training was more open, and it was intended to mean the access to education and to increase competence beyond the assistance. That can be kind of more of a design intervention, like co-design intervention, but in the training sense, it could go from I want to learn how to nettle or to create jam, or I want to learn how to use a computer properly because I am isolated in the countryside, and just knowing how to use a computer would make a difference. So it was rooted in their interest. Could go to management, for example, as well, but more on the theoretical part, or how to implement ecotourism initiatives. So it was more on the building competence in a more autonomous way. The other one is more on the intervention, assisted and collaborative intervention. I don't know if that's clear, Joern.
Yeah, that's clear. I think it wasn't so clear. Well, maybe it is clear in the writing, but it wasn't so clear from the writing to me. How you explained it now, it certainly makes sense. Yeah, so just something to be aware. Like I said, I don't know. This paper is probably in revision, something, right? I'm guessing.
I got the minor comments now last week, so there is a space to improve these things as well, which is exciting.
Might just one sentence, like it's not like a big thing, but a small thing maybe that can make things clearer. Or I'm the only one who misunderstood it, also possible.
Well, I agree with you now that you mentioned that, so it's appreciated. And I think that for the purpose of going beyond Uruguay and learning, like sharing lessons learned, it is important that people from different systems would understand properly what's the difference. So.
Right. So let's talk about your literature review chapter a little bit. There, I guess you got a little bit of critique from one of the reviewers and on the search terms. And actually, I had not read the reviews. I read the chapter and then I read the reviews by the other examiners, and I had exactly the same comment. So the comment is basically this, is that you use some search terms, including words like easement, and then you come up with findings showing that mostly people use things like easements. So meaning that, of course, the search term may sort of create a little bit of an unintended bias in what you come up with the answers. So can you comment on that at all?
Yeah. I think that there were many biases. On one side, the bias of the English language, and because there is literature in other languages. So by not including them, we are aimed at least being aware about that, not increase it by just choosing, for example, Spanish or Italian and leaving out other languages. No? So that on one side. And then on the search terms, it's something that I've been reflecting afterwards. And there were terms also missing. For example, our aim was to use as many terms that would be somehow synonyms to private land conservation in different contexts. So we included the easements, for example, the covenants in Australia, private reserve, privately protected area. So in that sense, I think that there was an unintended bias by including those, but it shouldn't have been so big, the bias, because we also included other synonyms in other regions that didn't come up as strong as easements. Mm-hmm. So it's not that we just included easements, but also private reserves and other kind of synonyms. Mm-hmm. But we also miss, for example, in the Nordic countries, now that we are in Finland, for example, forest conservation is typically done in private land conservation, and we didn't capture that, for example. So I'm sure that there would have been more studies coming up from the region here, and also agri-environment schemes that we didn't include because in the literature it was a bit mixed. There were some articles that had like a very strong agriculture focus and others not. So I think that the terms bias somehow the results, but nonetheless the trends are also aligned with other trends that have been found recently, and there are many explanations for that is not only pertinent to private land conservation publications inside.
So I mean I agree with everything you said, but I think it's there's one maybe additional dimension that I thought when I saw it. So indeed, agri-environment schemes is the main one that came to my mind, where basically the agri-environment schemes under Pillar 2 of the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe are pretty much private land conservation as you define it elsewhere, meaning I get money for certain breeding birds, or I get money for maintaining certain habitat features or whatever. So I think they would fall in there, and there's huge amounts of literature on that, and there's a huge amount of private land conservation in that sense going on. Interesting, by the way, and we come back to that later, is it effective? So we come back to the issue of effectiveness later on. There's a whole lot of, so I would argue there's a whole lot of European private land conservation literature, which isn't at all under the label of private land. And that's the second observation then in there, that somehow, depending on where you are in the world, you think of private land, or you just take it for granted that land is private, like in the EU. People don't talk about private land here. They talk about private land in Australia and in the US, and in many of the frontier cultures, I think they talk very much about private land. And in the EU, people don't talk about that so much. It's just taken for granted. What else would land be? But if you're a big rancher, then it's your property, and and it's sort of a different story. So I feel like there's a possible element of terminology, where people may have difficulties talking to one another between kind of European type systems and maybe more frontier type systems. So it's an interesting one to keep in mind for the future, that the terminology sometimes might be just very different.
Yeah, absolutely agree, and it would be very interesting to explore also, especially like and taking into account the different historical aspects as you are mentioning in shaping the way that we name the thing in terms of private land conservation and environmental schemes, and also how we measure success and how we frame policy also. So it's a very good point. Thanks.
So that's just one of the things that is somehow different across the world, like with many parallels, but that's one that's somehow different, how people think about that. So I want to move on a little bit to the general idea of stewardship, which is a central theme also in your work. And maybe to start with, you use the term environmental stewardship. So now, a devil's advocate question: what's the sort of ontological position inherent to this phrase? Meaning, does it not inherently view people as outside nature?
No, that's a very interesting question. In fact, our approach to the started from the fact that the area was conservation. There was also an attempt by the government to create a protected area in the region, which failed mainly because it was perceived as a top-down approach. But of course, there are other reasons for that. But then we wanted to go to the area and understand, kind of following more what the critical realists call a retroductive approach. That was how must the world be ontologically for these people to be taking care of nature. So it was trying to understand the conditions of possibility for the area to be a high priority for conservation without any external intervention, aware external intervention to foster conservation. So it was either a mix of factors given by the practices and traditional culture, and also maybe some market drivers that were, for example, creating external conditions for conservation or for land use change. But we wanted to understand what were the conditions, and in that sense, for example, stewardship, we didn't have any pre-definition about that. We didn't even know if they would perceive themselves in that way. So we build it from their perspective. And in that sense, as Christopher Raimond also has noticed in the dealer from his studies to this one, because people were explaining how they would take care of nature, but by also managing conflicts and having daily relationships with nature. So they had like an intrinsic social ecological system perspective to the thing, and they were people were key to conserve nature in the region, and one of the main drivers for them that was affected exodus. So by having less people, instead of according to their perception, it was
So I want to stick with that idea a bit. Draw out quite strongly, again, especially in your local case study paper, that people have a stewardship ethic of some sort, or rather, well, it's not entirely clear to me whether you're drawing out that they are stewards or you're claiming that they're stewards of nature. So are they actually stewards of the environment, or do they claim to be stewards of the environment? What I mean by that is I'm very aware of some farmers in Australia who think they're doing a great job, and if it wasn't for them, the whole world would fall apart. And it's not really true. It's not so good from an ecological perspective, some of the things that are going on there. So are they actually stewards, or are they just claiming to be stewards? And which of the two did you study?
Okay, that's good. Very interesting question. I think that they are actual stewards. First of all, I was mostly interested in their perception, in their own perception. So I wasn't interested in myself in trying to classify their stewardship. That came afterwards when analyzing the results in the perspective of the broader literature. But I think that they are actually stewards because they don't talk about it. They raise self-awareness by talking about it. So while we were talking about it, they started like saying, well, yeah, actually we are. So there is no discovered side in terms of stewardship, extra relationship with nature and the sense of place, and they started reflecting on that. And then from the ecological side of the social ecological system, it's an outstanding area for biodiversity, where many endangered species still exist, and the native grasslands are usually in good shape. Like 95% of their properties are covered by native ecosystem, at least. In most cases, it's 100%. So in that sense, we could assume that they are actual stewards because they don't necessarily talk about it. There is no hidden kind of intention of praising themselves, and they actually do the job without any conservation-minded. It's not about conservation for them. One of the responses that I quoted there is like, I take care of nature, but I am not environmentalist, no? Which has a political dimension as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and related to the issue of stewardship and the stewardship ethic in particular is the notion of crowding out. You mentioned crowding out, and maybe you can talk a bit about crowding out. In the meantime, I just want to say tell you an interesting example of some crowding in some of the work that I've been involved with recently. And that is about human-wildlife conflict in Namibia. People get compensation there for human-wildlife conflict. And initially, one might think it's because the monetary value of compensation is what makes them more tolerant of wildlife. But when you account for various other factors and compare it with Zambia next door, then you find that actually it's not the money, it's the better institutions that crowd in more tolerance towards wildlife. So in that case, money was involved, but the money wasn't really what mattered, but it was the better institutional design that made people more tolerant of wildlife conflicts. So what's the story with crowding out, crowding in your study area here? And how might it relate to this idea of a stewardship ethic?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and also a very interesting example in the non-monetary benefits in your study area. I read the paper, it was very interesting. In this case, I think that the main aspects behind crowding in and crowding out are related to better understanding their intrinsic and extrinsic motivations for conducting for stewardship and for conservation. So like following from the self-determination theory, for example, that provides a bit of a framework to understand the different sources of motivation related to different needs. In this case, both in of their perspective and also in the open-ended questions in the choice experiment, so at different scales, they were strongly mentioning the need for autonomy. That is also related to an intrinsic motivation, the need to build competence. So that is also somehow related to autonomy. They want to learn themselves how to do the thing. And also of relatedness, that is like creating a closer relationship between different landowners in social networks, but also in similar to your findings with institutions, because in the countryside, in some areas, the institutional, formal at least, institutional presence is low. So they were interested on those dimensions to support their stewardship, and also with a bit of distrust of the money as a way of crowding in. Like there will be something that I would be asked that will affect my autonomy or future generations' autonomy. So in that sense, they were more or less all the same, saying like we need support to do things better, to support to learn new ways of producing, but we don't want money for this. Mm-hmm. So that was a bit of the balance between. It doesn't mean that people are not interested in money. Yeah. So that's why we were mentioning the importance of having a flexible and in order to identify the best ways of crowding in and avoid crowding out as an enforced strategy.
Right. Okay. I want to come back to policy instruments a little bit in just a moment, but to start with maybe just a little bit more on your work with stakeholders. You described your place-based work, you described as a collaborative approach, and elsewhere you speak of a transdisciplinary approach. So can you say, especially with the term collaborative, what was collaborative about this?
Okay, thanks. It was collaboratively at different stages with different intensities. So by collaboratively, I refer to addressing like a problem in a way that it includes different stakeholders, because there is no single solution to that problem without engaging with diverse stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I mean those who are potentially affected or can influence the outcome of a process. In this case, it was, even if it was intending to inform policy, that we can also discuss about that and the challenges eventually to get there, but the main aim was to understand. So the opportunities and the enabling factors and the disabling potential disabling. I didn't address, for example, institutional capacity. That is a thing that it's absolutely important for understanding what the institutions can provide to the landowners, not just from the landowner's perspective. The idea was to include them to understand a bit of the feasibility of different policy alternatives that would emerge, and also to identify what kind of information would they need to inform the policies. And then by doing different workshops and interviews, we try to understand the landscape of needs and preferences from different stakeholders in the problem.
Okay. And you mentioned generally that you were interested in this collaborative approach with a diversity of stakeholders, but then I got the sense like, what about these plantation owners? It sounds like you didn't like plantations, and so they were not stakeholders. Are they also stakeholders, your plantation owners that are encroaching onto the landscape?
I think they are, and it's a very interesting point. I totally agree with you, and it was a matter of discussion during the design in this probably not so open kind of first stages of collaboration, both with the national institutions and with the local institutions as well. And we decided not to include these stakeholders who are like have a massive influence in the area, because they had a very different structure in terms of who you are addressing. Like in that case, for example, the forest companies have a governance that is completely different to the way that people or local families make decisions on their land. So the legitimacy also of these stakeholders, and particularly not the company as such, that is impersonal, but also of whom would we talk, and from the company, for example, a manager, someone from the board, or a forest ranger. it would have been very complex and make the kind of data that we wanted to use very heterogeneous. So we prefer to focus on the perception of the people that were managing the grasslands, but in next stages, it will be absolutely important to engage with forestry companies, because they also have conservation areas inside their land as part of the Forest Stewardship Council initiatives, for example. And since you mentioned this, I also wanted to acknowledge that we didn't include, as you did in, for example, in Transylvania, other broader stakeholders beyond the landowners. We didn't include people from the towns that are very small, but still, and they are rural workers, and they have an influence and a voice, and they need to be empowered in that sense, and we didn't include them either. But it would be important to have a broader kind of set of stakeholders in the next stages.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely, well, it's in fact critical that you make choices about who you involve and who you don't involve, because you can't do everything. In any piece of research, you need to make decisions. So there's absolutely no problem with that decision, I think. The thing gets interesting depending on who drives landscape change. You mentioned large influence. So if landscape change is driven a lot by these outside influences, by these external stakeholders, then I guess you need to, whether you like it or not, you need to get them to the table somehow, because they are influential stakeholders in the system. So, but as you say, that could be an interesting thing for the future, and it might depend on to what extent that is a primary concern. And so I think it's totally legitimate. Let's see, you mentioned cross-sectoral stakeholder engagement in your literature review paper, lamenting a lack of cross-sectoral stakeholder engagement. Can you explain what you mean by that a bit more, and why?
The cross-sector stakeholder engagement, I mean a similar kind of approach to the one that we were discussing now. Meaning that we would foster somehow collaboration and the integration and dialogue between different stakeholder sectors in our research, because there are different ways. I mean, engaging stakeholders is always challenging. Before, there are matters of legitimacy, matters of power, matters of previous collaboration or conflict, and in different interests. But I think that we gain shared understanding and a more comprehensive picture of what are the problems and potential solutions if we foster dialogue between. It's also easier sometimes, and it's totally legitimate to engage with one sector. For example, if you want to work with private land conservation, as I did in the second chapter, if we also interview other stakeholders and make them also interact to try to shape the problem in a more comprehensive way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Good. Then I think we leave stakeholders aside a bit, but stick with the paper we're just talking about, which is the review paper. Well, that's mainly where you made that comment, I think. But move on basically to the issue of policy. And you speak, there are different policy issues that you touch on, and I want to go through, I guess, a few different things here that came to my mind with respect to policy. So first of all, in the paper, in the review paper, you speak of different examples of policy instruments. And I was just wondering if you could explain those a bit more. I wrote down in section 2, and now I need to just flick through the paper to see exactly where I mean. I think right at the towards the end of the method section, basically, you have you say, I can just say what they are. You say regulatory and economic disincentives, property rights instruments, market-based instruments, financial instruments, public tax instruments, facilitative instruments. So those ones. Can you just give a couple of examples, or one example for each of those, or something, what they are? So like, what's a regulatory and economic disincentive, and so on?
Yeah, thanks. So the regulatory and disincentives and economic disincentives are more the traditional ways of engaging with private land conservation from the institutions and with landowners, meaning imposing some kind of restriction through land use planning, for example, on what they can plant or not, or if they can, for example, conduct some land use change or plant next to the river or like the distance. So it's more on the disincentive, which is an important part, but it wasn't so much addressed in the literature. I think that there is kind of a trend to voluntary private land conservation that has like important implications on the many opportunities, but also on the challenges behind the neoliberalization and the lack of the diminishing role of the state and the fostering of the landowner role and their independence. So, and then we are more focusing on what type of incentives do we want to provide. Mm-hmm. So that is on the disincentives and on the regulations. Then, if I remember correctly, legal and statutory innovations. Those are new rules that are emerging mainly in the US, for example, where, for example, you can conduct some trade-off in a kind of compensation way, where you, for example, change land use in this part of the land, but then you can conserve on other part of the land, and then there are new ways that have been explored, trying to find a balance with even offsetting approaches. Yeah. So that is on that side. Then one of the main ones and the most interesting ones is the property rights. That is where property and private land in many it's a diverse concept and complex concept, what it means to own something, and also from the legal perspective. For example, in the US and Australia, conservation easements are based on the fact that property rights are a bundle of rights. So it's not I own the property and homogeneously it's mine and that's it. But I can own different rights to, for example, use the property, to allow people to go inside the property, to change the land, to use the mineral resources. So this type of incentives rely on the fact that landowners can voluntarily donate some of those rights, or they are bought by civil society, for example, organizations. So the landowner will retain the ownership on some dimensions that might be important for them, but then they would give the right to conserve the land use cover to an NGO, for example. So that is a new way that has been increasing exponentially in the US in the shape of conservation easements, and conservation covenants in Australia, and their effectiveness and legitimacy, especially in diverse contexts with different political context and social context, it hasn't been studied enough yet. So it would be important to understand what kind of consequences, for example, for land grabbing or green grabbing, as it's called, like buying huge properties by an NGO, and the interaction between local people and these initiatives should be addressed as well. Then, market-based instruments are
maybe just keep the others. So I appreciate you actually going through them because I asked you, but keep them a little shorter so we still get to other things.
Yeah, thanks. No, well, these are well, we can talk about the two of them together probably. The market and financial incentives have to do with the certification schemes, for example. Is this idea that the market could provide solutions if we improve the market, then and increase the value of biodiversity in a market scheme, we can provide solutions to conservation and benefits to landowners. So they can sell, for example, biodiversity-friendly products, like biodiversity-friendly meat in the case of Uruguay, and it would increase the landowner's income and at the same time reinforce the friendly management.
Well, since we're going through it, public tax instruments, I guess that you've explained here very clearly in the text, and facilitative instruments we talked about before, I suppose, with training and things like that. Right?
Yeah, training and recognition also, that is one important aspect. And the public taxes, yeah, is like a tax exemption for some kind of taxes that. But all these incentives, just to close this, are related to the additionality of the policies. So these policies have to provide benefits to the broader society. So especially if they involve, for example, tax exemptions. So that's one of the dimensions that have been discussed about these policies. Like the property is important and the scale of the property is important, but if we are gonna provide tax exemption or the other type of incentives at the social level, we also need to perceive benefits beyond the property as a society.
Right. So the big challenge that I see with the different policy instruments available here relates to a comment that I think also Sarah Beckersey hinted at a little bit in her report, which is the issue of effectiveness. So what actually works? And the thing is, buying up property rights or locking up land, green grabbing, if you like. Why do people do green grabbing? Because it works. Because for conservation, it absolutely works. Basically putting a fence around stuff, getting people out there, fantastic way for conservation in many, many contexts. Not for everything, but generally speaking, that works pretty well. All these other things, like maybe waiting for a marketing solution or hoping for a training course. I mean, how do we know that this actually works for biodiversity conservation? If we put a fence around it, we know that works. So can you say anything about that? Because all the things you end up recommending are kind of these lame things that they sound very nice and they'll make the people happy, but will they actually do anything?
Yeah, that's very good, a very important kind of question. And I think that we need to come up with a definition, a comprehensive definition and understanding of how do we measure effectiveness.
Yeah.
And we need to be very aware about that and have an open discussion at the academic and also at the broader societal level. Because there are matters of scale. So we put a fence and it works inside, for example, even if we concede the fact that it works, because we keep, for example, the rhino, as we want to conserve rhinos, then the rhinos are there. But then if we broaden up a bit the scale, then it might be that we have social conflict outside that per se, in terms of procedural justice, is wrong. And also it would eventually, in a temporal scale, compromise the rhino also. So thinking about this as we started with a conversation from a social ecological perspective, and understanding that even if we have, for example, a strict protected area without people, it is still part of a broader social ecological system. Right. Because it is there because of the decision of people to leave it there and exclude it. And I think that we cannot discard any of these strategies, but we need to think carefully about how we measure effectiveness, especially as we are dealing with a crisis. So we are in a hurry to try to, like, the boat is sinking and we are also like pushing water outside the boat. And that is part of the thing, but also we need to think about how we fix the boat in a way that it would like continue floating beyond us, like throwing water with a bucket. So in that sense, I think that, for example, reflecting from my studies, I became aware that, for example, I was doing things in a relatively slow way, engaging stakeholders, because my main aim was to foster conservation, for example. But it wasn't the only game, and the only aim. We also have other aspects that sometimes we are aware of, sometimes we are not, and they should be explicitly brought into the aims. So the aim is to conserve these species, but also to engage stakeholders per se, and to increase shared understanding of the problems, and to reduce poverty and inequality. So all those things are part of the aims.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you mention this and that you take the social. I think a very good answer that you gave. The bit that I liked was saying that effectiveness can't be judged just on conservation, but if we're in a social ecological system, you have multiple domains of effectiveness, basically, and you need to somehow balance and understand all of them. So I think that's a really interesting one. And it's interesting also in the context of the trend that we're seeing at the moment. So I think conservation, from my perspective, is currently very strange. On the one hand, we have this kind of approach like you're taking, which is increasingly stakeholder oriented and increasingly systems oriented. And on the other hand, we have things like the Half Earth initiative, with people very strongly pushing for massive expansion of protected areas and so on. So really interesting. And you don't necessarily need to comment on this, but really interesting time, I think, in conservation, because we have two coexisting paradigms at the moment, which I think are possibly mutually exclusive to an extent. In terms of, and they are both very vocal camps in the conservation literature. So fascinating. I think there's this, stay tuned, I would say, for that space and see what's going to happen.
Absolutely. I think that it is growing a bit and on the tension also between the two sides. But I think that it also reflects we would benefit from more epistemic humility also on how we understand the problems and how we understand the solutions. And that is a key aspect for me, at least, because we might need to use defenses and as, for example, you were showing in your research in Ethiopia, for example, it might be that in some regions, like having a protected area and, for example, going for the land sparing approach could be good and could provide a solution, and in other cases not. So these two camps are also very, they are discussing in a way that they don't acknowledge that the complexity sometimes of the problems that we are facing. And we also are sometimes unaware of our ethical position about these things. And I think that we should also try to understand broader, because the main drivers for the conservation problems are not going to be tackled by creating a protected area more or less. We are talking here about overconsumption, inequality, climate change, and those kind of need another level of reflection, at least in that sense.
Very true, yeah. One thing I want to, before we move on to broadening yet further out, but one thing I wanted to mention in terms of policy instruments is a bit, I found it a bit puzzling. So I hope you can explain it to me. The study area that you're studying in the People and Nature paper is a biosphere reserve.
Yeah.
So isn't that already private land conservation then? Isn't it already happening? A biosphere reserve stipulates you have core areas, buffer zones, mixed use, blah, blah, so it's already happening anyway. So I was a bit puzzled, as in, is it not already happening? What are you talking about?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. There are two things there to consider. One is that the biosphere reserve is only one part of the area, so it doesn't cover the whole area. And then that's just a comment, actually, because the most interesting part has to do with the lack of proper management and planning for that area. So eventually the biosphere reserve is there, and it provides to a certain level with some institutional kind of framework to work in the area, but it is actually not having any particular influence on the management, to the point that most of the landowners were not even aware about the fact that they were inside. So it's more on this kind of paper packs approach, the condition that we were discussing before. And it's also interesting because there is a protected area right next to this area. And yeah, I think that it would be very interesting to understand better how people perceive the protected area next to this area, and to better understand why they didn't want, or how would they want a protected area to be in the region. because it wasn't addressed. It was a sensitive topic because there was a social conflict related to the protected area creation. So we didn't ask about that. But in the last question, that was like, is there anything else you want to say? It always came out as a reflection from the landowners. So I think that it would be very important to understand what are the main differences between, like, 1 kilometer from here, we have a protected area, and here we don't.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Good. Then let's start to broaden out a bit with an eye to the time, and hoping that at some point we will finish and everyone can go and still do other things this afternoon. Let's broaden out and think a bit about the context dependence of your findings. And I mean, I said this right at the very beginning, it is place-based research, and it is, I think, a very valuable thing to do decent place-based research. But what can we maybe learn in terms of general lessons, would you say?
Yeah, that's a very important issue to think and to try to discuss. There are limitations of transferability of the results, so we have to be cautious when transferring the results to other regions, even within Uruguay, for example, that we have, like, in Western Uruguay, different type of soils. The presence of agriculture is stronger because of that as well, and the values and the worldviews might differ. So even if within a small country, we might have different dimensions to consider. But there are lessons learned, and I think that it would be very important to try to increase our understanding of comparing case studies, for example, in the case of Transylvania with the rural exodus, and also the impact of land use change. I was reading most of those papers also as an inspiration for designing the research, and then the results also were quite similar in terms of the perception of the problems, as you noted before. So I think that in that case, it's very important to think to which are the contextual factors that will influence the perceptions and also the outcomes eventually, and which are the across context aspects that would work, for example, and provide, for example, insights beyond the context. I think that's increasingly needed. And in my opinion, I think that the context would express even more in the ways forward, like when conducting, for example, scenario planning. When we characterize the problem, we might agree that we have rural exodus in cultural landscapes, and we have, like, a low profit from traditional production. So to that level it might be, but then our cultural dimensions might express even more on how do we move forward from here.
Right. So maybe we take this example, rural exodus, and two solutions come up almost, I think, all the time somehow, no matter where the study is undertaken, and depending on who undertakes the study as well. And these two solutions are the following. One, ecotourism will save us. And two, get rid of people, rewilding is the answer. So both of those, are they generic recipes for success? Are they generic failures for success? What's the story for ecotourism? What's the story for rewilding?
Yeah, I think that there are no panaceas, as sometimes we tend to forget. So I am, in general, from my perspective, I'm open to all, because we are living a crisis where we need to really, we cannot afford to discard any strategy a priori, but we need to understand how would it work in different contexts. So, for example, I beyond the philosophical discussion that we can have about rewilding and the impact on people-nature connectedness, if we are not, like, driving people more apart from nature, and what's the idea that we have about that as a back of our mind in this wilderness approach, like following the far and high from the grandfathers of conservation, for example, in Yellowstone in the US. Beyond that, we will need to understand what are the consequences. In Uruguay, it was perceived like rural exodus as a problem, because people were saying, we are the ones conserving the land, we are also like conserving the local culture, so it would be a loss both for biodiversity and for people if we leave. And they were providing clear examples. We were going around in the area, for example, they were showing where people would live. There was either forestry or there were exotic invasive species that were sprouting there. So those were two main threats that would come from not having people on the land. Also, they were expressing like control of poaching, for example, as well. And on the rewilding side, there are also opportunities and there are needs for nature to come back in many dimensions. For example, in different parts of the watersheds, if we are currently, for example, having problems with water quality in many areas, and it would benefit, for example, from following more a rewilding approach at different scales in the heads of the watersheds, for example, to make sure that we provide benefits to people in terms of water quality. But I think that the key to success eventually is to discuss and understand the implications of the possible strategies with different people involved, affected, or with interest in the thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, I mean, you mentioned that we're in a crisis, and you're basically saying, you mentioned the analogy of the boat with shoveling out, bucketing out the water earlier. So, I mean, that's a sort of relatively, well, it's a sad view of the world somehow, and you call it a wicked problem in your introductory chapter. And I'm wondering, is it a wicked problem? Elsewhere, you use the phrase where you speak about unlimited growth in competitive market economies. I mean, you've just named the problem, haven't you? Is it really a wicked problem, or is it just one that we need to deal with?
Okay, yeah, that's a very
broad question now.
No, but it's a very interesting one. I'm going to try to keep short. Sorry about the long responses, but it's quite exciting to be talking about these things.
Fine.
I think that it is a big problem because of the complexities that are inherent to these systems. We are dealing also with systems that are embedded, that are, for example, the social dimensions of the system are teleological. So there are purposes behind people. So they want to achieve certain things at the individual level and at the social level. For example, we are dealing with that complexity, and then we are dealing with the biophysical dimension that is teleonomic on the biological side, like there is function that comes from natural selection, for example, and there is no function at all coming from rocks and other, and even like other dimensions of the social. So there is an inherent complexity inside these systems that make it a weak problem. That you cannot cut nature at its joints in a way of identifying like simple solutions. To every complex problem, there is a simple solution. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. So in that sense, I think it's important to understand that. But at the same time, we have to engage with the broader kind of questions that are also teleological. It's like, where do we want to go as people, individual, and also as societies? And as the problem is becoming increasingly global, also we need to reflect at that scale. And then into that complexity, I think that the main aspects are related to our role as consumerists and our role as political individuals, and how we understand our role and the role of society in the planet, and dimensions such as equality and poverty alleviation and well-being actually behind this thing.
Thank you. That's almost a beautiful closing statement. I'd like to ask you, I guess, in a way, to deliver a closing statement of yours, and I will deliver one, of course, as well. But what I'd like you to do as a sort of final thing to ask you is, what do you think, what's the role of the sort of place-based research that you have undertaken relative to the kinds of global challenges that we're facing? So where do you feel like, what should we do, if you like, from a scientific perspective, but also from a citizen perspective, perhaps, to deal with the problems on the one hand at the place-based level, like what can a study like yours do, and what else needs to be done maybe at higher levels, and who ought to be doing that?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, but very interesting. I think that from my perspective, I'm going to talk, of course, as I've been doing from my perspective. I think that we need to start thinking and acting more at the local level, because it's kind of a human perspective. From a human perspective, it's a human scale where we can, for example, perceive efficacy and develop social relations and create networks and dialogue, share understanding of the problems, and dissent as well. That sometimes is kind of the hidden problem, which is actually not. It turns into social conflict when you don't actually embrace dissent as part of a pluralist society. So I think that in that case, not being afraid of having different worldviews and at the human scale where we are living our lives, it will be very important to act in that sense and to try to engage. And then at the global level, of course, or at regional and national levels, I think that there is a need for a level of governance or a level of reflection that there are some already science policy interfaces like IPBES who are not work in terms of governance per se, but they are a stakeholder that is aiming to scale up all these local or even national processes into a global understanding. And in that case, I think that we need to embrace pluralism as a way of engaging with societies that are not necessarily Western, different non-Western societies and their ethical perspectives to what it means to live a good life, which is actually the main thing that we are all pursuing at the individual level and then interacting with others. So ethics should go beyond our relationship with nature, but our relationship with other human beings and how do we live our lives. And then it doesn't mean the same for a consequentialist or for a deontologist or for a virtue ethicist or for an Ubuntu Hinduism. So we have a complex world, and I think that also following these kind of approaches, of pluralist approaches with biocultural also perspectives that are emerging now is key in order to try to understand better the complexity of the challenges that we are facing and identify solutions that might already be there, and then we are like discussing about the Western perspective on things without understanding that there might be opportunities to learn outside our perspectives.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was a very nice closing statement and gave you, I guess, a last opportunity to really speak in depth about the various different facets that you have been thinking about across scales between nature and people, about ranging really from ethics to markets and so on. So really thank you very much for that statement. And at this point, I have no further questions and would like to come to my closing statement for this examination. So the thesis produced by Gonzalo investigated private land conservation using a multi-scaled and mixed methods approach, and it included a global scale literature review, a national level assessment of how private land conservation could be incentivized better or enhanced, and a landscape level case study also where he worked with stakeholders. These three separate scientific contributions were then synthesized in a very coherent narrative via an introductory chapter to the thesis. In our discussion now, range of issues, a very broad range of issues, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. It's fun to play ping pong, if you like, with someone who's able to hold the ball in the air with you and really address many, many different facets. I think we've covered a huge range of topics, from crowding out to conservation to some ecological aspects, spanning the whole globe as we went. So really fun. Thank you very much for that. So